There's an old Indian proverb, a proverb which is to be found in many languages and in many different cultures, but it is rather significant, I think. Do not judge a man until you've walked in his moccasins. Until you've been through the trials and tribulations of another individual, it's difficult to know how you would react. In the course of the past 3 weeks, a number of things have really cemented themselves within my mind around that particular theme. For as we stood at Yad Vashem, which is the memorial to the Holocaust, in which as one walks through, one sees the documentation and the pictures of what was happening in Nazi Germany, one cannot be too judgmental of what, for example, the freedom fighters among the Jews did or did not do, for we have never been in that situation. And our guide made the point that early on, young Jewish people in Israel were very critical of those they accused of going like lambs to the slaughter, but have long since learned that until you have been in that situation, you do not know what you would do. As we traveled through many of the churches, as one does on a trip like this, David, in a special way, was feeling things. And at each of the stops, he would ask if he could have, out of the money which he had saved to take on the trip to buy souvenirs, a quarter to put in the offering box. One time I said to him, David, is that enough? And he thought for a long time, and he said, yes, I think it is. And I smiled. And outside, Chris reminded me that that is 1 week's allowance. The widow's mite, perhaps. Which one of us, in church after church after church, would take a week's of our salary and put it into the offering box? And the commitment in a very special way of one who gave all because he was there. Hit. But we joined it a number of times in services, and what I'd like to do is a couple of small vignettes to try to explain some of the things that I was thinking about in a different way, and perhaps to begin to understand why, for me and for others, this kind of thing is so important. We arrived in Cairo and flew down to Luxor, ancient Thebes. Those of you that have been enjoying this marvelous weather of rain will not understand what it's like to be in temperatures of 120 degrees in the shade, if you could find it, in a land which for years knows not rain. Indeed, it has only been since the building of the dam at Aswan that this whole area has ever recorded a rainfall. All of the water came from the Nile. And for thousands of years, there has been no rain at all in the entire area. One can certainly plan a picnic. We went into the Valley of the Kings, and we spent many long hours trudging through 120-degree weather, visiting the tombs of Thutmose III and Ramses II and Ramses V and the Sixth and the Queen's tombs and Hatshepsut, the temple, and various things like that, each one having been warned by me in advance, carrying big water bottles and drinking mightily to keep from becoming too hydrated. It was nice to get back to the air-conditioned boat and to begin our cruising, having visited this area. And as one went down the river, we stopped at a number of places and would get off the boat and 100 yards, 200 yards inland, suddenly find desert. For along the shore, one can see green, but soon as you leave the place where the river Nile flows, there is desert. And we would trudge to a temple, and we would visit and listen to our guide and come back to the air-conditioned ship and sit down and go and relax as we traveled along the Nile. We had done this for 5 days. We had seen temples with the beautiful carvings on the walls that depicted what life was like, not for the average person, but for the wealthy in the age of the pharaohs. We had seen the richness of food, of game, of oils and spices and wealth. We had gone over and over again the many gods and what they did and what they represented. We had seen the splendor to be found in a tomb like King Tut. We had imagined what it would be like to be a pharaoh or Pharaoh's daughter in time of Moses. To have those who served thee, who when you came in out of the heat rubbed you with the oils that restore elasticity and softness to the skin. We had seen the huge piles of food carved into the walls. And our mind's eye began to expand, that as we returned even to the air-conditioned ship, we recognized that while for us the 120-degree blazing sun was so difficult, for those who were not only adjusted but who were also pampered, it was no problem at all. And then we paused on Easter Sunday, not our Easter Sunday, but the Coptic Church's Easter Sunday, and we reflected upon not the resurrection as found in the New Testament, but the resurrection of the people of God as recorded in the Old Testament. Picture, if you will, walk in the moccasin with me, the description I've been giving. Here is a blazing sun of 120 degrees, and that's not the full sun of summer. This is somewhat the cool season. You stand at the river and you look, and in no single place can you not see sandy dunes, rocky mountains, and desert. You remember that Moses was an individual who was pampered with all of the wealth of Egypt, according to the biblical story. One who was raised in the splendor of the food, of the slaves and servants, of the dress, of the oils, of the many opportunities. And then you say to yourself, under what kind of compulsion could you get people to turn their back on the only source of life they have known for 400 years, the Nile River, running through this narrow green belt, and to march off into the wilderness to serve a God? For we had not marched in the wilderness, but we had walked a few hundred yards and felt the parching thirst and the tremendous heat. We had not set off with the commitment to go wherever God led us. We could not imagine facing the wilderness, the kind of commitment that took. I think there's a lesson for us. For each one of us in our own lives, in a different way, faces the wilderness, the unknown. For many, it's comfortable to stand by the paths that we've walked all the time and never to ask any questions about it. We are completely content to see the river flowing down between our little lives of greenery, and we don't want to face the harshness which means expanding our ideas, our horizons, our thoughts. We don't want to march out into the wilderness of our own lives to find that which is new and potential and to discover a new God in our lives. We want to be sure that when we go, everything is provided for us. We want to dam up the rivers of our lives if at all possible and to send off streams going to the sides so that they will be green and we never have to leave that which is comfortable. And yet the biblical commitment to God is a commitment of faith that says, even when I do not know where I am going, I go with faith and confidence in God. To accept the challenges of the desert, if that be it, or of the wilderness. To march with faith in Him, even though it may not be the more comfortable path. To accept God's purpose for me and to step forward and to accomplish. Not to look back and yearn for the bread baskets of Egypt, even though it meant slavery, but to be free under God, to expand and grow. What a lesson. To have walked, in a sense, in the moccasins of the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Israelites, and to recognize that the call of God is a resounding call which reaches to each of us as individuals and steps out far beyond the comfortable and says, if you would serve me, be willing to go and follow. The following Sunday was a different kind of a Sunday. By that time, we had arrived in Israel. We had visited Bethlehem and seen something of the old city. And we stopped at one of the sites of Shepherd's Field. I've mentioned it several times, but it hit me again. In every single case where there are events recorded in the Bible, there are at least two sites that are traditional, arguing for the event happening there. For example, in Nazareth, There's a beautiful church of the Annunciation, relatively new, where Mary stood while gathering water at the well, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto her, as you'll remember the Gospels, and told her that she was to be the bearer of a son. There's a smaller Greek Orthodox church that claims the same fame. I had seen both of those before, and this time we went to a third church. Ornate, as so many of the churches are, far beyond the simple tastes of Pine Hill and the simplicity of the sites, covered over with all kinds of what can only be called, in my mind, spaghetti, lamps and hangings and crosses and crucifix and drapings and all of the things which really are not part of our congregational history and therefore slightly foreign to us. But devoutly believing, the caretaker explained why this was the legitimate site of the Annunciation. Well, there are two Shepherd's Field. One of them is just outside Bethlehem. You stand on the road and you look out over the field, but there's a separate one, a Franciscan place, where as you go, you look out over the fields and you find a cave. And above the cave, a church, and within the cave, a church. And we paused to reflect on that particular Sunday as a group about some things that we had been seeing. Most of us are recognized that within church traditions there are two events that are of significance. The rest of it is of minor importance. I hate to say it, but I think you know it to be true. In most church traditions, the focus is upon the birth of Jesus and upon the death of Jesus, and very little of what came in between is of any importance. Highly interesting, but not of importance. You see this almost totally as you travel throughout, where all of the churches commemorate these events and spend very little time and very little concern about what Jesus was all about in his earthly ministry. There's a tendency to see Jesus in the Holy Land, and we saw group after group after group of pilgrims who would not visit Yad Vashem, who would not visit Masada because, quote, that has nothing to do with Christianity, who were not interested in the people of the land, the agriculture, the feelings, the mood, all of the things that provide a background for fully understanding the biblical record, but who wanted to, quote, walk the steps that Jesus walked, and who somehow or another visualized that Jesus never quite touched the road, but passed along at a significant height above. And you could see the groups, almost with tears in their eyes, and God loved them for that, as they worshiped together at every site, and never asked the questions of what did Jesus signify to the people who stood there when he stood there and taught them. And as we were in Shepherd's Field, and as we tried to understand the joy of God that the shepherds themselves might have felt, we could not help but reflect upon the fact that Jesus lived a human life. For whatever else you do in terms of your theology of Jesus, he walked at that time, by every single theological definition known, a human life. His feet got every bit as dusty as our feet got. He felt the parching sun every bit as much as we felt the parching sun. He wandered up the hills and breathed deeply every bit as much as those of us who, though out of shape, had begun to get more and more into shape, walked up the hills and breathed deeply. He perspired under the broiling sun in the same way that we did. He stumbled over the same kinds of admixture of stone and sand that a hidden stone would catch us that we stumbled over. He felt perhaps the soreness of his feet, having walked perhaps as much as 25 or 30 miles in a day that each one of us felt as we came back from a long tour and wanted only to get our shoes off and our feet up. He appreciated in a way that we would have appreciated the washing of our feet, the removing of the dust, the kneading of oil into them so that they became cool instead of hot and parched. But not only that, while walking that way, while the birth and the death may be of significance, he taught. And for those of us growing out of the tradition which we have here, the teachings of Jesus were highly significant. For it is in the teachings of Jesus that we find the answer to our own life. It is in the significance of how he faced the crucial events of his own life. that we too find the answer to the facing of the crucial events in our own lives. And so it was in a particular way that as we began our trip up in Galilee and began to walk in Nazareth and Capernaum and Tiberias and saw the places where much of the teaching took place, that we paused upon the mountaintop, the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, looking out over the lake, which that morning was very quiet, as it is in the morning, and very still. And seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountains. And when he sat down with his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And please recognize the mourning is not which makes one happy, but happy are those who are comforted when they shall mourn. Happy are those who have the kingdom of heaven, for they are poor in spirit. Put the blessing where it is. It is not upon the mourning. It is not upon the discomfort. It is upon the joy that one finds of God active in his life. Happy are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Happy are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Happy are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Happy are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons or children of God. Happy are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. How often those who are persecuted forget the righteousness' sake. Happy are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Happy are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. As we read the Sermon on the Mount, as it's called, looking out and reflecting, the only group at this site for some reason, which is an unusual thing when you're traveling in that area, quietly sitting under trees, listening to birds sing, and looking out over the mountain past the church which had been built to commemorate the Sermon on the Mount. We read through and we came to that passage about turning the other cheek. And our Israeli guide, who in a very special way opened up her land and her people to us, engaged us in conversation and asked a simple question. Within our tradition, she said, one does not turn the other cheek, which is exactly as Jesus had said. How do you interpret in our situation the turning of the other cheek? How do you interpret? How do you, when you are a land and a people that have enemies who are threatening to utterly destroy you, turn the other cheek? How do you, in a land which is 30 years old and having had 4 major wars and witnessed the death of others, not only in war, but in terrorist acts, innocent bystanders who driving down a road find a bus under attack and exploding from grenades with no chance of defense, turn the other cheek? How do you do it? Or do you do it? And what is the significance of it? Does one close the eyes to reality and turn the other cheek and have it beaten as well by those who enjoy? But we're living in an age which once again brings in a freshness to mind the fact that while we feel that we have a conscience beyond which we will not go, we are dealing with people oftentimes who have no conscience at all in terms of our Christian morality. We are witnessing in Iran now the kind of slaughter which comes when one closes his eyes to all kinds of mercy and seeks only a vindictive form of justice. We have witnessed in recent weeks the tales of horror coming out of Uganda, where Idi Amin, and estimates vary between 300,000 and 500,000, put people to death for the pure pleasure of it. Where the reports are that the guards were sadistic and enjoyed the torture and slaughter of of men, women, and children for the sheer pleasure. We have witnessed and seen, as we've walked throughout the Near East, that there are currents of thought which have not been modulated by the Judeo-Christian tradition of love and forgiveness and openness. And we have seen people and read and understood that there are those who cry for a vengeance now and a slaughter of those living, both Arab and Jew, Christians included, Christian Arabs and others, in the land now called Israel, where they are to be driven in the sea and destroyed. And in the words of an ancient Pharaoh, their seed shall be no more. Ronit was asking a very significant question of us as Christians. What would you do in that situation? What would you do that if in Windsor, Canada, a group of dissident Americans began firing shells into West Bloomfield on a regular basis, aiming for schools and Henry Ford Hospital as particularly significant targets, attacking lone homes, and as you drive down the street, threatening you individually, one by one, with destruction. School buses are particularly significant, and all of your kids go on outings with their schools. What would you do when every one of the teachers was accompanied by a rifle and two soldiers with machine guns had to go with every school outing because children are the favorite targets of the terrorists? Would you turn the other cheek in a meek way and saying, yes, slaughter my children, but slaughter them again pietistically? Or would you become angry, hateful, spiteful? How many of you would call for armed forces to move into Windsor and wipe out the terrorists who are threatening your homes and your lives? That's the situation, and you know it. And as I try to grapple sitting there in a way differently than I grapple with it sitting here where I'm safe and relatively inured to the hostilities and the threats, I could only say that the turning of the other cheek is a different thing than I have seen before. It is not a blithe when somebody smacks you on the right side, turning to the left and say, hit me again. For that is not only stupid, it does nothing to help the other individual. It glorifies violence, and it's a sense in which I try to glorify myself by saying, hey, Lord, look how much I'm willing to take for thy purposes, which is a denial of God in my life. It is not done to justify God. It is done from my own self-aggrandizement. No, rather the turning of the other cheek, I think, is a totally different thing. It means that when there is righteousness, I resist for righteousness' sake. It means that I will not permit the kind of hatred and bitterness and evil which is directed towards me and my family to become a part of my life by accepting it into my life. It means that I as an individual have an obligation, searching under God, dangerous though that obligation is, for it is easy to overstep the boundaries of justice and righteousness in a Christian sense. I have an obligation to stand firm as I search within myself to find the godly dimension and to say no to evil, to say no to that which is not righteous, to say no to that which is wrong. But the turning of the other cheek means that when the other person responds to me and acknowledging that the broken fellowship can be restored, I am then not turned off because of hostilities which have come before, but willing to re-cement our relationship. And at that time, saying, while I have been hurt and our reconciliation is difficult, I am now willing for the first time to turn my face and open up the unhurt cheek to a new relationship. One of peace and hope and justice and love. How difficult that is. Not only in the political world, but in the personal world where our fights and our angers and our hostilities oftentimes close us off and we build walls and say, never again, Lord, never again will I have anything to do with that individual. How difficult it is to understand the teaching of Jesus in the light of that when the time comes from reconciliation, we step forward eagerly and turn our cheek. And be open to the potential of God working in our lives. For you see, ultimately we're back to the first point where we start off by marching into the uncharted wilderness as an act of faith in God and as a commitment to each other. To pause and to reflect while standing in a small way in the moccasins of another